Hey folks, I'm Will Jarvis. Along with my dad, Dr. David Jarvis, I host the podcast Narratives. Narratives is a project exploring the ways in which the world is better than it has been, the ways it is worse, and the paths toward making a better, more definite future. I hope you enjoy it. Well, hey, folks. Today on the podcast, we've got Ben Reinhardt. Did I get your name pronunciation right?
Perfect.
Okay, the German I in the back. Okay, perfect. So Ben, I'd like to get kicked off. Could you just give us a, kind of a brief bio? What your mission statement is and what you're trying to do in the world.
Sure. So I'll start with that. Very simply, it's I want there to be more awesome sci-fi in the world. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah,
I forgot to ask.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's not for kids.
All right. So that's at the end of the day, like that's what I'm trying to do. And I guess my bio is, if you want to sort of tie a narrative around it, it's me trying out different ways of doing that and realizing that they're not the right way, and so trying a different way. So I went to grad school because I thought, yes, if I get a PhD then and build spaceships, that's the correct way to make there be more awesome sci-fi stuff. And I found that wasn't quite the right thing. And so I was like, yes, if I go and I join a startup and I build amazing augmented reality technology, that will be the way to bring the sci-fi future. And that was not the right way. So I was like, yes, if I quit and start a company, that will be the right way. That there's some trouble there. And so I was like, yes, well, if I then instead help other people start companies. And so I went and I worked at a VC firm and this place called Entrepreneur First, and maybe that will be the way to enable it. I realized that wasn't quite right either. So now I've come to the conclusion that the current institutional structures that we have right now are not, they constrain certain activities out of happening that I think are essential to having there be more awesome sci-fi stuff in the world. And so I'm trying to figure out what institutional structures might be able to fill that gap and how to build them.
That's awesome. Do you think there has been a change since the 70s and how fast innovation has gone on? And so we had these really wacky scientists back in the day. Like Peter Thiel has this line that the letter from Einstein wouldn't get to the president's desk today, and that seems to be true on some level. It almost seems like academia has weeded out the weird people. Like Isaac Newton, half of his time was on, I don't know if it was half his time, was on alchemy, and the other half was gravity, right?
I think that possibly seems to be more than half of his time.
That's good to know.
Yeah. So yes, I do sort of buy into the whole great stagnation
decadence
thesis.
kind of argument.
Yeah. So I definitely think that is the case. I think the more interesting question is why is that the case? And then the even more interesting question is, even putting aside the why is only interesting insofar as we can use that to reverse that or right. Sort of speed things up again.
Exactly.
In my opinion.
That makes a lot of sense. So what have you found so far? Because I know you've tried a lot of different things. What has been most effective? What do you think the clearest vision you have for kind of accelerating technology and, on the back end science as well?
Yeah. So I'm going to take sort of one step back and try to disambiguate that a little bit, because yeah. I think one of the sort of meta realizations is that there are many that sort of lumping it all together beyond saying there's some problem.
Right.
It's not too useful to lump it all together. So I would sort of disambiguate and say I think sort of startups are really good at a certain set of activities, right? So they're really good at bringing novel solutions to new markets. But then I think the trick is that a lot of the activities that need to happen now are not that. So in terms of things that are especially effective, like I think at the level of granularity of a podcast, the things that I would say are going to sound like things that everybody sort of knows. The trick is like how to make them happen, right? So it's like get like really good teams of smart people together, like give them a good focus and let them go, but then keeps them sort of tightly on the rails. So I think the interesting thing is like, how do you navigate all of the incentives that people have and that are in the world, in order to allow those things to happen, to allow the effective things to happen.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I guess what you're saying is like startups are good at certain problems.
Yeah.
And so even when we think about venture capital, it's like it may be Peter Thiel again. Someone at Founders Fund has this line. It's like venture capital's between like $1 million and or maybe a little bit less, and then $1 billion. But it's somewhere between there. Once you get above that, it's like this is not where venture capital would be useful. So like, are you saying there's like things that are too capital intensive, or they're just like if there's not a clear revenue opportunity or profit motive immediately, like if it's too long term, there's no reason for people to go after it?
Yeah, I would say all of the above. I think what the way that I would frame it is that venture capital has a certain set of constraints, and I think the interesting thing is that you can sort of think of all institutional structures as having a certain set of constraints, and when you start looking at it through that lens, then you start to see like, okay, like what things are sort of constrained out of existing. So for example, venture capitalists have the constraint that they need to raise a new fund every couple of years. In order to raise a new fund, you need to go to your LPs, right?
Show return on capital.
Exactly. And so it's like, even if you're making a 10-year bet, which VCs do, you need to be able to show that bet is sort of continuously increasing. And so you need, and the only way that you can price a venture capital investment is if you raise a round.
Right.
And so you're, as a venture capitalist, you're then sort of constrained out of investing in things that don't have sort of a legible regular price increase.
Gotcha.
And so it's like a little bit more subtle than just the amount of capital, but yeah. So it's like
things that are like difficult to value in the short term, at least.
Yeah, or like, and that like don't sort of follow like a nice growth curve, right? So
gotcha.
Yeah.
So what would be a good example of that? Like a problem like that?
So I guess like from my like I'll just like my personal experience.
Yeah, definitely.
Sort of like trying to build an entirely new system, I think is really sort of falls into that. So like I worked at a company called Magic Leap for a couple of years, and we were trying to build, basically they were trying to build like an entirely new like computer interface. And
really cool demos. I remember that.
Super cool demos. And like the technology was super cool. The trick was that there were so many pieces that needed to be built that it wasn't like the rate at which they needed to like get a product out there and start showing increasing numbers.
Right.
Prevented the kind of approach that I think that they needed to successfully introduce like an entirely new way of interacting with computer. So that's one example. I think it's also just like places where like more abstractly where you want to build a new system, and in order to build that new system, you actually need to create several components, and any one of those components on their own is fairly worthless or like isn't that valuable. It's only in combination that they're really valuable.
Gotcha.
The pressure from to sort of get a product out there to start increasing in value makes you start trying to monetize each of those components, which then sort of like punts the eventual system farther and farther off until it like never exists.
Right. That makes sense. So you focus on the short term, and I've worked in the startups since I graduated, and this is true. Like you've got this grand vision you're trying to accomplish. And then in the short term, it's like, well, we got to make it to next week. Right. And so
Exactly.
next week always dominates it, like no matter what.
Yeah.
And you can get some slack. Like I think Scott had a post on Slack, maybe.
I love that post. Yes.
Can you
Studies
talk
on
about that a
Slack.
little bit?
I mean, well, sure. So Scott
Just a quick post.
Alexander, author of Study Start Codex, has a post. It's called Studies on Slack, and it is amazing. And you, the listener, should pause and go read it.
I'll put a link in.
But in short, it's effectively, it makes the argument that in order to get, so like if you think of yourself as like some water and you're trying to get to the lowest possible point, then the and if you're like purely just doing optimization, you go to the lowest local point, but that might not be the lowest global point. So like the
Gotcha.
global minima
Right.
in a sort of optimization parlance. And in order to sort of like get to a global minima, you need some amount of slack. And you could imagine that in this like water analogy, you could imagine that as like the ability to sometimes go against gravity. So get into another puddle. That's a poor explanation, but it's
I think no, that's great. And I think you also mentioned the development of like an eye.
Oh yeah.
As a great example. Like this is
Yeah.
incredibly complex thing, and you really couldn't just, through these super hyper competitive processes, create something as complex as an eye.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's really interesting to me. So do you think some of what happened is things have gotten super competitive in some weird senses? Is it like so I think of like the academic like grant process where like essentially, so my mother-in-law writes grants, and it seems like, and there's actually econ papers on this where all the profits from grant writing get competed away in the end. Like it's like this complete net loss. Is that a real phenomenon that just
that's absolutely a real phenomena. I think if you calculate the amount, like if you price people's time at some amount of money, and then you multiply that by the amount of time that people in aggregate spend writing grants, it comes out to be some number that's like way bigger than the amount of the grant itself. So I think you're spot on, or at least in my analysis.
Exactly.
You're spot on about the competition, and so like in academia, absolutely. There's a pretty strong argument, I think, that the reason that sort of the great R&D labs of the past went away is at least in large part because of increased competition on companies. If you look at it, like both Xerox PARC and Bell Labs, which are sort of like the paragons of R&D labs, were both part of monopolies, right? And so these people were getting monopoly rents, and that's sort of what they needed to run those labs. And so this isn't me, like it's this tricky thing because there's like culturally, sort of as 21st century Americans, we definitely are inculcated to think that competition is good, right? Like competition is what like forces people to improve and get better. And like, I agree with that. But at the same time, you sort of have to put on this other hat and be like, well, you also need a little bit of slack. And I think that we don't have that in sort of our current like innovation ecosystem.
That makes a lot of sense. And there's this great I can't remember who gave this talk. I'll have to find the link, but they were talking about how it was in the context of free trade and Japanese automakers, and how they use protectionist policies to allow like, Japanese cars to get really good and outcompete American cars. And like there's these weird effects that, like, yes, like free trade does get us better products at the end of the day. And like more competition gives us better, cheaper products, but there are also back end effects that can happen, and we should think about them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the really good book on that is this book called How Asia Works, that sort of talks about
interesting
sort of the difference between like why South Korea and Japan managed to rebound from World War II pretty handily, while countries like Malaysia sort of have not. And they really sort of go into that, like, I mean, at the end of the day, it's like protectionism, which is like a dirty word. But it gave the companies the slack they needed to like become Toyota, right? Like become
Largest
great car company.
auto manufacturers.
Yeah.
Which is quite valuable to have that in your country. That's really interesting. So I wanted to jump back, and so you mentioned Bell Labs, Xerox PARC, these places that no longer exist. A lot of because competition came through and got rid of all their monopoly rents, and they don't have the money to do it anymore, or they get competed away, don't exist anymore. Sorry, I didn't say that very well, but
technically they do.
Really?
That's the interesting thing is both Bell Labs and Xerox PARC are still places. They still have employees. They still do research.
Do they really?
Yeah, absolutely. They just
actually.
Yeah, that's they're just not.
It's not the same
like
thing.
They're not their former selves.
Right. So it seems like Google, right? So they are the ones they're the most clear example to me that should be doing this, because they have cash equivalents that, when I checked a couple of years ago, it was like 100 billion in cash equivalents. I mean, they're sitting on 100.
A lot of money.
They're burning like, some percent in just inflation every year, right? Because they don't know what to do with it. And it seems like this clear chance, and they speak about being like this highly innovative company, like I have their phone, right? I use their search engines, but maybe they've done that with like maybe their life sciences stuff a little bit, where they've invested in anti-aging research, but it seems like they should be doing more. And I often wonder if like the backlash against big tech at its core is some complaint about them not living up to the promise at the end of the day. I don't know.
Yeah, there's sort of, can I take that two directions?
Actually? Yeah,
absolutely. So one is, I would argue that to some extent they are, and the way that they're doing that is you look at the results that came out of DeepMind recently, right?
Oh, right.
That's GPT-3. Google money. Exactly. But like AlphaFold.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so we're talking in December 2020, and DeepMind recently released AlphaFold and
the protein folding stuff.
Exactly. Okay. And like, so, and like similarly, there's like really good work that comes out of Google Brain. So gotcha. I would argue that those organizations actually are sort of doing that, like doing the Bell Labs equivalent for Google.
Gotcha.
The trick is that I have like a wacky theory that in order for corporate R&D to be really effective, it needs to address some amount of like existential threat to the parent company.
Gotcha.
And like Google's existential threats come in the form of like software, right? Like they need better software. And so you could expect their corporate art, like their high quality corporate R&D to be in software. And that's what you see. And so I think the thing is, like, what we want is for Google to have really high quality R&D in atoms. But because that is not going to address an existential threat to them, except in places like, like tensor processing units, like that's not going to happen. So that's the thought there. And then I think, to your point about like people, like the sort of like the techlash against them for not feeding back, I think that's absolutely spot on. And like arguably the like the whole reason Bell Labs existed was sort of as a peace offering to the American public, for like AT&T to say like, look, we're good guys, we make technology and like spread it into the world. So yeah, I'd love to see a little more of that.
That's really interesting. I've got two responses that make me that I've just thought about. So one is we talked to Zvi Moshowitz. Have you read his blog? It's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So
I know of him because I played Magic the Gathering very competitively when I was younger. So.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, he's a big deal, man. It's cool. So we were talking to Zvi, and I've had this thought for a while, and what you just told me confirms that my pre-existing belief here is that, and I'd love to get your take on this. Is there anything that we can do to motivate people that is not an existential threat? because like, like we had World War II, right? The Cold War, and these are like existential threats, and we rose the challenge. COVID, we've had a lot of trouble, right? It's like not big enough. Like that's kind of scary. And then like you mentioned, like these research labs, if it's not an existential threat to the company, do people ever really work very hard? I don't know. Is there a way to get around that?
Yeah, I don't know. Is like the real answer is I don't know. I would love to figure it out. I think perhaps another way of framing it is like, how can we make existential threats be more in line with the sorts of things that we want to see? Like, and so where I go with that is like, you think about like medieval cathedrals, and arguably medieval cathedrals actually were addressing an existential threat because people thought that their souls were on the line, and that if they did not build things to the glory of God, then they were going to go to hell
For a long time.
forever.
Really long time.
And sort of and so like you can still put that in the existential threat framework. It's just that existential threats were a very different thing to those people. And so I just sort of wonder if like, can we shift culturally so that the things that are existential threats to companies or individuals just so happen to align with the things that we sort of want to see in the world. I don't know. That's just something I muse on.
No, that's it seems really important. It does seem to be a huge challenge because we just have to figure out ways to motivate people, or else these problems don't get solved. That does remind me. So you talked to Don Braban.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so actually I'm talking to him in like a month or two. I've got some schedule. Yeah. So because I read his book, and then I was like, oh, I'm gonna email him because I found out like, okay, he's still alive, and like here's his email. And then I found your podcast, which was super awesome with him and very informative. And what do you think about his idea of just, essentially giving really, really smart, talented, weird people money and just saying go?
Yeah, I think sort of again, like going back to a point earlier is this point of disambiguation. I think that the sort of venture research idea that's sort of his thing is really good for a certain set of activities that are essential. So I think it's really good for like what he calls like the Planck Club. So people who are really trying to sort of like pry new knowledge from the grips of nature itself. Right. And I think that's it's really good for that. What I don't think is that it's like, I don't think that that's what we should do for like everybody who has any sort of innovative idea at all.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So maybe good for like pure research or something, but this very select group of people maybe, but not the solution to
like
everything.
A select group of people, like, and I think it's actually a really a fascinating challenge to try to think about sort of like what are the parameters of like that sort of area of like activity space,
right?
Where it's like is it does it have to do with like the sort of like the size of the group that you need to do the discovery, right? Because he was funding sort of like very small groups of like 1 to 3 people. It's like, is that the key thing? Is it the time scale? Is it like that these are things that these people were like devoting their life's work? But yeah.
That's really, it's really interesting. So maybe like a partial solution to one problem is the answer.
Exactly. And my hypothesis is that that's sort of what we need, is like there isn't going to be like the solution,
right?
Like capital T, capital S.
Exactly.
It is going to be lots of like specific solutions for specific parts of activity space.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you think peer review is as evil as he says it is?
Yes.
That's good. I'm not in academia, so I don't know.
Yeah. I think that he makes the strongest argument for it. But I don't think that he's wrong. I I guess maybe what I would argue, like I would argue that it's bad, but what I'm not as confident as he is that it is sort of like the sole perpetrator of
Gotcha.
the problems with academic funding. I think that's where I might soften it a little bit.
Gotcha. That makes a
But
lot of
it's
sense.
terrible.
It's bad. It's really bad.
Yeah.
So what do you think some of the other problems are? Like just the grant process, all the politicians win, or
Yeah.
are there other things?
Yeah, I think there are there are many things.
Just many
So some, like I'll just like throw out some of them.
Yeah.
Is like and the thing to keep in mind is it's like, well, at the end of the day, we really want to try to find are like the root causes. And it's really tricky because like all of these factors sort of like feed into each other, and it's really unclear of like where to start untangling or the ball of thread. Right. But like some problems are the fact that academia has sort of become like highly overloaded. Like we expect academia to both sort of like train new researchers, educate, do like general undergraduate education. So educate like citizens of a liberal republic.
Joe Schmo coming in,
Yeah, exactly. To do like sort of like deep exploratory natural sciences, and at the same time do basically industrial research, and at the same time basically do like military research, and at the same time like be like thought leaders, right? Like it's like, oh, listen to like the scientists that we listen to. So like they need to be like have like so so it's like highly overloaded. I talked to friends who are professors, and we were like counting off the number of jobs that they actually do. Oh, and the professors are expected to be administrators as well.
Yep.
Right?
That's crazy, man.
So like professors are doing like 4 or 5 jobs at once, and each one involves a very different way of thinking, right? So like there's like my friend literally had to go from like arguing with an undergraduate about the grade the midterm to like, what is the research program that I need to set up for the next 5 to 10 years, like in an afternoon.
like how are you gonna actually how are you gonna actually make discoveries when you're trying to juggle all that?
Exactly. So that's one of the problems. Another is just like the sheer number of people who hope to become professors versus the number of people who are professors, and then the sort of the way that professors are judged, right? So it's like and just like the way that tenure works is another problem, because it's like, here, come in, we're going to judge you on like how many papers you publish and how much grant money you bring in your first couple of years at the university. And like the people who pass through this filter that filters for like really aggressively publishing papers and doing research are the ones who then get to stick around forever and are expected to do like 20-year projects.
Exactly.
Right? So it's like there's a little tension there.
Right. Exactly. No, that's really fascinating. And then you're right. So and then there's this huge glut, right? And so that just drives it makes it more competitive, and then you get more of these weird effects.
Exactly. It goes right back to that competition thing, where there's no slack in academia, like zero.
God, it just it seems so screwed up on so many levels. So you've recently been writing a little bit about another organization that does things a little bit differently, and we've done a little bit of work with them in the past. So DARPA, and so what makes DARPA special, and maybe the program manager model that's a little bit different?
Yeah. So the thing that sort of defines the DARPA model is that it sort of revolves around these what are called empowered program managers. And so instead of either having some sort of like manager level person or like an executive say like, okay, this is what we're going to do, And then at the same time, and also contrasted to having a researcher say, okay, this is what I want to do. You have these program managers who are given like an incredible amount of leeway to go to the researchers, try to understand what the researchers think, and then go to people in the military and see what they need. And then basically design a program that coordinates the efforts of several research groups that go across academia and industry to try to accomplish fairly audacious goals. And I think so. The thing that really makes them different is one, just the structure of the program managers, and then two, the amount of leeway that those program managers are given.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. It does seem like freedom does seem to be really important in these things, and giving like one guy, you can go wring his neck if it doesn't work out in 10 years, and like just go manage it.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
We see that with COVID, right? The best things that have happened in the US are like, okay, we appoint some Army Corps of Engineers guy and we say, go do it. And here's $26 billion and you get a vaccine.
Yeah,
in this like
exactly.
record amount of time.
I think a really consistent thing that I've observed is that the thing that seems crucial to all these things is like trust. That you need to be able to like trust that like this person, if you give them a lot of power, they're actually going to go do the right thing.
Gotcha.
And so like, I think almost like a systematic lack of trust may be another thing that I think one of the core reasons that we're seeing all this slowdown, because like if you don't trust people, then you either need to restrict their action or like force them to like give you lots of metrics.
That makes a lot of sense. And you see this in like the defense contractors. So our CTO, a really good friend of mine, he won the Technologist of the Year at Lockheed Martin. And nice. He will sit there and describe sometimes, okay, so like, what does Lockheed Martin manufacture, Will? And I'm like, I don't know, F-35s, He's like, no, it's billable hours. That's what matters. And it's like, it's firm fixed priced and you've got billable hours. And that's because the contractors, one time they screwed over the government and they were selling these Cokes in Iraq for like $10 a pop. Well, they were, in actuality, it probably cost them like $7 a pop, but this is a big news story. And so you go in and it's like, because one bad thing happens, you create this rule for everybody, and that just piles on and piles on and piles on, and then it just gets worse and worse and worse.
Exactly. That nails it. And I think you see that sort of everywhere.
I
would argue that DARPA actually could not, like in its current form in the government, could not be started today, and that it's basically been grandfathered in because it was started in the 50s and had such a good track record.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It can just, that's really, and that's a real problem, right? That's a real problem.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And the only solutions I've seen that seem to work at all. Have you seen this? So you're in North Carolina right now. Did you see the DMV?
In North Carolina?
This is really interesting. So
no.
The DMV, and I'm not sure exactly why they did this, but this has actually worked pretty well. So if you ever do anything with the DMV now, it's really cool. You can do it all through an app at this point.
Nice.
It works much better than it used to. And how did they get there? Well, they took the DMV, which was in Raleigh, and moved it 60 miles east to my hometown, Rocky Mountain, in the middle of nowhere. And what that did was essentially 70% of the people quit, and you can rebuild the organization. And like, so I do wonder if, the answer is, well, DC goes to Kansas City or something. I don't know, just somewhere in the middle. And
North Dakota.
You know what? And we're just going to restart it, right? In Bozeman, Montana or something.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing about DARPA that I think actually is does really help, is that it's just like program managers are out after 5 years. Like it doesn't matter how good a job you did. It doesn't matter how, if you do a really, really bad job, you're out before 5 years. And so I think that there really is something to that sort of like refresh.
That short tenure.
Yeah.
Do you know how they had the idea for DARPA originally?
Yeah. It was basically like Dwight Eisenhower freaking out over uh so what it was is, if I get this story correctly, it was that there were like, this was like height of the Cold War. Like the Russians are just starting to test H bombs. We need to be able to understand like what they're doing and defend ourselves from them. And so there's like sort of all these like crazy programs going on in the military to try to apply science to these critical national defense problems.
Right.
And so they're like, okay, we're just gonna like stick it all together in this one agency.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's it's also interesting. Are there any other keys you think that they've had to keep it avoiding entropy in DARPA itself?
Yeah. Well, so I would caveat it with like, I don't think that they have completely avoided entropy.
Interesting. That's good.
So I would like, I think that it has like slowly become more and more of a government agency, and so it's like, I don't want anybody thinking that it's perfect, but it is still like really, like, considering how well they've done over the course of 60 years, like it's really impressive. But like ways to avoid entropy, I think it's one, a big one that I think maybe is understated is the fact that it's stayed really small. It's
interesting.
It's about 100 program managers, and like my hunch is that number is not a coincidence, and it like happens to be right around Dunbar's number. And my hunch is that there is something to the fact that like everybody in the organization can kind of know what everybody else is up to, that actually helps build that trust that we were talking about.
Interesting.
So I think that's really clutch. And then also what it means is that they, because it's small and because it actually has relatively small amount of money in the grand scheme of things with DoD funding, like it's like just over a little more than $1 billion a year.
Gotcha.
And that's a lot of money, but not a lot compared to DoD funding. And so what that means is that there's a little bit less pressure
gotcha.
to deliver. And the anecdote that I love is there was a director in the 90s who actually went to Congress and petitioned to have DARPA's budget lowered because
really?
Yeah, and he made the argument that like, if you give us too much money, you're going to expect too much out of us. And I think this is actually another way of creating like a little bit of slack, is that if you have a lot, like if you're overfunded, then you have no slack to sort of like try crazy stuff. So I think that like the size is another way that they've managed to avoid entropy. And I think it's also just like, this is like really sort of tropey, but like they get really good people. Like they
interesting.
Like they really focus on just like, they don't care about backgrounds very much. It's just like, okay, like who can we get in here who can
do a good job?
Yeah, exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. And it also seems like keeping it small like that means that you don't have this problem where you're forcing money in places where like maybe it's like, I don't know, this is not like a great idea, but we're doing it just because we got to keep this. And you want to keep your budget, right? You always want to try and keep your budget, so you're going to spend it. We see this in like corporate environments at all time. It's like, well, we got $100,000 left. Got to go buy something, right? Because they're going to cut our budget next year.
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting. So I wanted to move on to another topic. Do you think problems, and this is a very large question, so I want to preface it. Do you think problems have gotten harder in general in science and technology?
Yeah, that's a really good question that I am not sure I have a good answer to.
It's a very hard question.
I think that it depends on where we're looking, right? Okay. Like it's like I think that like certainly like problems in physics, like any field with a name, I think that the problems have gotten harder. But that's like kind of the definition of a field. But then I think I think the problem is that we haven't been inventing as fast as we used to. And so it's like that's almost what I think the real problem is, more so than like the problems have gotten harder. Because it's like let's think through this. If like the problems were harder, like I feel like the problems are like exactly as hard as people can solve, almost by definition. Where it's
Gotcha.
like yeah, I don't know, how would you compare like the hardness of two problems?
That's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's really difficult. Yeah, it's almost yeah. Yeah. Where do you even start, right?
yeah. I mean, it's like definitely, um,
It's
it's
like
like
maybe you know it if you see it. Like maybe that's it, but it's like
yeah.
obscenity or something like that. I don't know.
Well, let's. I think maybe a proxy is like, so equipment is definitely like in order to do a lot of cutting edge experiments, equipment is definitely more expensive in some areas. Right, like,
Right. Yeah.
and that's definitely true. But at the same time, we're a much wealthier society than we were 100, 200 years ago.
That's right.
So does that balance out? And then the cost of equipment has fallen in other areas, right? Like
That's right.
sequencing a genome is much less expensive than it was years ago. So it's just like, yeah, I struck like I think it's a good question to think about, but a possibly impossible one to answer. But just
Gotcha.
because it's not answerable does not mean it's not worthwhile to like talk about and
Ponder.
think about together. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, I do really like your heuristic. If it has a name, by definition, these problems will be more difficult. And I think
Yeah.
that it's almost because there are more people looking, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, that's another thing is like, yeah, it's like once you say like, okay, like it's physics, and like then you have like a whole bunch of physicists and the physicists rush
Yeah.
in. Yeah, exactly. So yeah.
Do you think some of the problems we've seen with slower, well, what I see to be slower advances in like biology are like, I have this weird thought that people get selected into physics. You just mentioned physics. So like physics is like, that is the hardest thing. That's the most interesting. And I had a really smart roommate in college, like, this is what I want to go do. And I was always like, man, like, I think like there are more gains to be made in other places, right? And
Yeah.
not at like the top end of like, string theory or something where only 100 people understand it. And there's, no way for me to evaluate whether it has any salt or at all, right? Like, I don't know.
Sorry, like I think I missed the question.
Do you think we select we've got a poor selection mechanism in that perhaps like physics is high status and that it sucks up a lot of talent that could be going to like, particularly I think about biology.
I actually think we might have the opposite problem.
Interesting.
In that, like, I think biology, like at least now, biology is like the new hotness. Like,
Gotcha.
you look at, I don't know, it's like I try to keep my pulse on like what are the smart people interested in, and it feels
Right.
like they're all interested in biology. And it feels like, I don't know, for me at least, I run across so many people who originally went towards physics,
Yeah.
but then sort of like realized that it was a shit show, and then they like went into biology or finance or computer science. So I think the problem might actually be that like we don't have enough smart people in physics because it's become such like a esoteric mess.
Right. Less applications and more. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. That's really interesting.
Yeah. I don't know though. Like it's yeah.
Very cool. So I wanted to move on now. So you studied medieval history and mechanical engineering in undergrad, right?
Yeah. Yes, that's correct.
And so you're talking about fields that don't have a name. Well, this one has one now. What do you think about Clio dynamics or in Peter Turchin and things like that?
Yeah. I want to like it. Like,
Right,
it's like we all want psychohistory to be a thing, right?
Yes.
But as far as I can tell, it is no more a predictive science than just straight up historians pattern matching, like it's like so I've not studied it deeply, so I'm not well qualified to sort of opine on it. I haven't read his
Gotcha.
books. I've read several of his articles. I've read sort of commentary on it.
Gotcha.
But as far as I can tell, like it's for the most part, it's just like narrative pattern matching,
Right.
similar to any other kind of narrative pattern matching. And like there's value to that. And like I think that's the thing, is like I don't want to denigrate that. And I think that the like what we don't do is we don't actually assign enough value to like non-scientific knowledge. And I think that there's probably a lot of non-scientific knowledge that he's poking at, and it's worth understanding. But then sort of like saying that it's scientific, like predictive knowledge, would also be incorrect.
Gotcha. It almost seems like using the science aspect is almost like a sales tool, right? Like, like, wow, like look what we're finally making it empirical. These antiquarians running around, just like
I might, I don't know. I would actually take the charitable view and say, like, I think that they actually do see it as scientific.
Gotcha.
Like I don't think it's just a sales tool. I don't think that it's there's sort of like no theory behind the hypotheses, right? It's just like, okay, like let's match some patterns and then create some post hoc explanations for why we see these patterns.
Gotcha.
Yeah. What do you think?
It's tough to tell. I mean, it's really like, it's so complex, right? I mean, at the end of the day, and I do applaud them for trying. I mean, I think it's a great thing to try to do.
Yeah. And it might become like that's the thing, is like I think that like we want to render these like immediate judgments, but like going back to Newton and like astronomy, like and alchemy, right? Like we got chemistry because we had a bunch of people like trying alchemy for hundreds of years,
right?
And if we'd gone and said like, oh, you shouldn't do alchemy because it's not science, then we like, which would have been correct, right?
Exactly.
We would never get chemistry. So I guess like it's like I occupy this weird space where it's like I both want to say like, no, it's not really science, but then that doesn't necessarily mean that we should denigrate
it out. Right, exactly. Makes a lot of sense. That's cool. So I had a fun question for you that I was interested in. So David, we had David Friedman on, and I asked him a similar question. The question is what do most lay people not understand about medieval history?
Oh boy. I think the sort of, there's one, like I'll give the more common like answer, I think, would be that people like assume that sort of like nothing happened in the Middle Ages, right? Like that it was just sort of like it's like Roman Empire declined, and then there's like a whole bunch of people like digging around in the dirt and hitting each other with swords for like for almost 1,000 years, and then the Renaissance happened, right? And so it's like and it's like actually people like they did a lot of inventing. It's like they figure out how to do windmills, and like actually a lot of philosophical breakthroughs happened in the Middle Ages. And so I think cool. that's one. I think the really interesting thing that I love about medieval history is that people, I think, actually take this really charitable, like this thing, they think this way that really comes to their hearts. And I think that people in the Middle Ages thought like we do. Like it was basically like,
interesting,
they're just like us. And I think that is actually a misconception. Like people literally, like in the core of their beings, they thought very differently from us. Like I think like relics are a really good example of this, where like relics are like literally it's like a body part from a saint, right? And they would like carry it through the streets, and people would like flip out and get really excited and like think of it as if that saint was literally like walking through their street. And like so the modern interpretation would be like, oh well, they're really excited about it because other people are excited about it, or they're really excited about it because it was like a festival and equated that with like the like getting to like have a party with the saint. And it's
Right.
like, no, you like when you read the primary sources, as far as I can tell, like they actually just thought of it as the saint was walking through the street. And so
Really?
I think that yeah, like and that's it it's really interesting. And it's like I like to say that like other people are both much more similar to you than you expect, but at the same time they're like much more different than you can even imagine.
Man, that is, yeah, that is incredibly interesting. I've had that thought. So I really like to read about the Civil War, and I especially like to read newspapers that I read now. Like, how did they
Oh,
report
that's
about this
cool.
event? So like I read about the Economist, the Atlantic, and the New York Times are all like, very well established. They have archives. And
Yeah.
you can go back and read these things and like what people thought, and it's just like incredibly bizarre to like a modern person. Like, does that make sense? Like, and
Yeah,
it's something you just
absolutely.
echoed. Like it's hard to grok how different we thought about these things. I
Yeah,
guess that makes sense.
exactly. Exactly. And I think it's and the really humbling thing about it for me at least is like, well, in like 50 or 100 years, like how bizarre is the way that we think about things now going to be? And it sort of gives you a little bit of humility, whereas like I feel like some people kind of have this attitude that's like, okay, like we've like the morality that we have now and like our priorities are like the correct thing. And it's
Right.
like, well, maybe.
Maybe. Exactly. Well, and even within our lifetimes, I mean, like gay marriage was not like a majority opinion. Like, and that's almost, it's unthinkable nowadays for
Yeah,
even for
exactly.
me and everyone I interact with. And that's just bizarre. That's just bizarre to think about. And that's a short time domain. That's not, hundreds of years.
Yeah, that's like our lifetimes.
Yeah. It's weird.
Yeah,
Interesting. So Ben, I have one last question for you for today.
totally.
So what do the next 10 years look like for you in working on innovation systems?
Uh, well,
It's a big question. No, it's not a small
yeah.
question.
So I can tell you what. Let's see. So I will give you the optimistic scenario that I'm shooting for.
I like it.
And obviously, like this could very easily change. But the sort of the game plan is I hope to put my time and money where my mouth is, and try to create an organization that sort of like riffs on the ARPA model. Like that's
Nice.
what I hope to do. And obviously that can like what that ends up looking like is sort of like can change, but like my working hypothesis right now is that it's like create a private organization that does revolve around this program manager driven model, and sort of use it to both enable more awesome stuff, but also hopefully sort of like uh, demonstrate a new institutional model, because I sort of unlike startups, I don't think that it'll scale like to the
Yeah.
point about like DARPA. I think one of the things that's kept it working well is that it's small, and so hopefully it'll be like, okay, like we need many more of these things.
Right.
We need many more people doing that. So, and hopefully that I will still be working on that in 10 years, because I see it as a multi-decade project.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And what do you see as the biggest challenges to making it happen?
Oh boy. I think the big like so very abstractly, I think the biggest challenge is almost like surviving long enough without being pushed into something suboptimal, like into like a suboptimal form,
chasing a product rabbit hole or something.
Yeah, chasing a product rabbit hole or becoming like a consultancy or like sort of without being like it's like becoming distracted. So like surviving long enough to actually sort of like become self-sustaining. Like I think that's the goal, like to become a self-catalyzing thing. I think that's one challenge. And then I think the other is like staying really honest towards like doing awesome stuff without like drinking your own Kool-Aid.
Right.
In a way.
That's fair.
Yeah. I think that those are like obviously like there's really challenges like how do you make money work? Like
right,
how do you
right,
make the
things like that.
organizational structure work? And it's like these are like huge challenges, but I think they sort of all are sort of
kind of the
towards a
obvious
goal.
ones, right? Like
Yeah.
that one would think about, but that does seem really important, is how do you keep the mission at the forefront throughout all the distractions, right?
Yeah, exactly. But
That's cool.
like while keeping the lights on.
Right, exactly. Keeping everybody fed, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's cool. Well, Ben, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find your work, and where should they go looking for you? And
I mean, I'm on Twitter, sort of at Ben_Reinhardt. And then my website is just my name, BenjaminReinhardt.com. Those are sort of the two places on the internet that you can usually find me.
Very cool. Well, thanks, Ben. We appreciate it.
Well, this is great. This is super fun. Thank you for having me on.
Had a great time.
All right. Take care.
Well, that's our show for today. I'm Will Jarvis.
And I'm Will's dad.
Join us next week for more narratives.